Hey everyone, welcome to the show. You ever think about what it would be like to be on the verge of your dream job
Hmm.
and you're this top legal scholar, you're about to step into this prestigious university position
Oh, yeah.
and then boom, one tweet turns your world upside down, you're labeled a racist, there are student protests and your whole career hangs in the balance?
Yeah, it's like ripped from the headlines almost, isn't it?
Totally. It's like a dystopian novel or something.
And that's basically what happened to Ilya Shapiro, the author of the book we're diving into today, Lawless, The Miseducation of America's Elites.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so it's a wild story personally, but it also goes deep into some really big questions about free speech and academic freedom and what's going on in legal education today.
So let's get into Shapiro's story.
Okay.
So he gets hired to lead Georgetown Law's Center for the Constitution.
Huge deal.
Right, he's at the top of his game.
Top of his game.
But then he posts this tweet criticizing President Biden's pledge to nominate a black woman to the Supreme Court.
Right.
And he argued that focusing on race and gender could exclude potentially more qualified candidates. And he even suggested someone like Srinivasan.
Yeah, Srinivasan's got a pretty impressive resume. Appointed by Obama, argued tons of Supreme Court cases, highly respected.
So was Shapiro saying that identity politics was trumping qualifications?
That was essentially his point.
Yeah.
Yeah, and in today's climate, someone like Srinivasan might get overlooked because he doesn't fit a specific demographic.
And that obviously didn't go over very well.
No, not at all. The internet kind of exploded. He was immediately branded a racist, and Georgetown Law put him on administrative leave before he even started.
It's crazy how quickly things can escalate like that.
Oh, yeah. The world of social media and cancel culture.
Yeah.
It's intense.
It's like the court of public opinion delivered a verdict before he even had a chance to defend himself.
Exactly.
But it goes deeper than just one tweet, right? Georgetown launched a full-blown investigation.
They did. And, this is even though the tweet happened before he was officially employed there. Yeah, so his critics were arguing that this tweet created a hostile educational environment.
So they were basically saying that his words alone, even before he set foot on campus, were enough to make students feel unsafe.
Right, or unwelcome.
So it's not just about what you say, but about the potential impact of your words.
Exactly. And this whole concept of a hostile educational environment is really key to understanding how universities are approaching these situations these days.
So even if that impact is based on someone's interpretation rather than any direct harm.
Right. And Shapiro pushed back hard against this idea,
So of course.
saying his words were taken out of context and that he was just expressing his opinion on a matter of public policy.
Yeah.
But, in the end, he felt like he couldn't do his job effectively under that level of scrutiny, and so he resigned.
I mean, it seems like a no-win situation. If you express an opinion that goes against the grain, you risk being labeled as insensitive or worse, even if you didn't mean it that way.
Right.
But then self-censorship doesn't feel like the answer either.
No, and that's exactly the chilling effect that Shapiro is concerned about.
Right.
If academics, especially in a field like law, are afraid to voice dissenting opinions for fear of being canceled, how can we have these open and honest debates? How can we challenge existing ideas and really push the boundaries of knowledge?
It's like we're walking a tightrope between encouraging free speech and protecting people from harm.
Totally.
But where do you draw the line? And who gets to decide what's acceptable and what's not?
Right. These are big questions.
This feels like a much bigger conversation we need to be having, not just in academia, but in society as a whole.
Absolutely. And Shapiro uses his personal experience as a jumping off point to explore these broader trends in legal education. And, he argues that this whole focus on DEI.
Diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yeah. And the rise of these DEI bureaucracies within universities is actually contributing to a climate of illiberalism.
Okay.
Where certain viewpoints are silenced or deemed unacceptable.
So he's saying that, on the surface, promoting diversity and inclusion seems like a good thing.
Of course.
But is there a point where it starts to clash with other values like free speech and academic freedom?
That's the million-dollar question. And I think that's what makes Shapiro's book so compelling. Regardless of whether you agree with his conclusions, he's not just throwing out opinions. He's backing them up with real-world examples, personal anecdotes, and a historical analysis.
So we've got this backdrop of Shapiro's personal experience with cancel culture.
Right.
But the book goes way beyond that.
Yeah.
He's making some pretty bold claims about what's happening in legal education and what it means for the future of the legal profession.
He is, and he doesn't shy away from controversy.
I bet.
He uses terms like wimpy lawyers to describe what he sees as a generation of law students who are being taught to prioritize social justice activism over the core principles of legal practice, like defending clients' rights, upholding the rule of law, and engaging in robust debate.
So is he saying that law schools are failing to prepare students for the realities of being a lawyer?
That's essentially his
I
argument.
mean, that's a pretty serious accusation.
It is. And to understand his argument, we need to dig into some of the specific examples he highlights, which we'll do as we continue this deep dive.
Okay.
But he talks about these other high-profile cases of cancel culture in law schools and the impact of critical race theory on legal education. And what he sees as this growing trend towards ideological conformity that's stifling intellectual diversity.
I'm really interested to hear more about that. But before we move on, what stood out to you so far? Like, what resonated with your own experiences or concerns?
Well, for me, it's this tension between promoting inclusivity and protecting free speech. It's such a complex issue, and there are no easy answers. And I think Shapiro's book really highlights the challenges that we're all facing in trying to navigate this new landscape.
It's a conversation we need to be having. It's not about choosing sides.
No.
It's about figuring out how to balance these competing values in a way that's fair and just for everyone.
I agree.
We'll be back in a moment to continue this deep dive.
All right, so let's get into some of the specific examples that Shapiro uses to illustrate this whole idea of illiberalism in legal education. One that really stands out is the incident with Judge Kyle Duncan at Stanford Law School.
Oh, yeah, that one got a lot of attention.
Yeah.
Can you give us a quick rundown for those who haven't heard about it?
Sure. So Duncan is a conservative federal judge, and he was invited to speak at Stanford by the Federalist Society, which is a student group.
Okay.
But before he even arrived, the associate dean for DEI sent out an email criticizing Duncan's judicial opinions and claiming that his presence would harm marginalized communities.
So they basically condemned him for his views before he even got there.
Pretty much. And then during the actual event, things escalated quickly.
Oh, I bet.
Duncan was constantly interrupted and heckled by student protesters to the point where the DEI dean actually had to step in.
Really? To, calm things down?
Well, not exactly. Instead of defending Duncan's right to speak the DEI, Dean actually, kind of joined the protesters and started lecturing Duncan about the impact of his words.
So instead of upholding free speech,
Yeah.
they basically sided with the people who were trying to silence him.
That's how Shapiro sees it. And he thinks it really gets to the heart of his argument about DEI offices. Are they there to promote diversity of thought or to enforce ideological conformity?
Yeah, in that case, it seems pretty clear which side they were on.
Right. And it makes you think back to what we were talking about earlier with the chilling effect.
Right. If you're a professor or a student with views that are considered unacceptable, even if they're well-reasoned and backed up by evidence, are you really going to feel comfortable speaking up?
Exactly. And Shapiro argues that this kind of environment where certain viewpoints are just silenced or punished isn't good for true intellectual inquiry.
Yeah, it's more about shutting down debate than actually engaging with different ideas.
Right. And he believes it's creating a generation of lawyers who are more focused on social justice activism than the core principles of the legal profession.
So it's not just about free speech. It's about shaping the way that future lawyers think and approach their work.
Exactly. And he uses that term, wimpy lawyers, because he thinks they're being taught to shy away from confrontation, avoid taking on controversial cases, and to prioritize feelings over facts and legal precedent.
I can see how some people would be offended by that term.
Yeah.
But I also get his point. If lawyers are afraid to challenge the status quo or defend unpopular clients, who's going to protect our rights?
That's the question he's asking, and it's not just about lawyers. It's about the role of law in a free society. If law becomes a tool of ideology rather than a neutral arbiter of justice, what happens to our fundamental rights?
Okay, so we've got this big picture concern about the future of the legal profession. But Shapiro also gets into some very specific examples, right?
He does. He provides a whole catalog of these incidents that he thinks illustrate this trend. Another one he focuses on is the case of a Yale law student who used the phrase trap house in a party invitation.
A party invitation. And that became a major controversy.
It did. The student was a black man, and he was hauled before the diversity office and accused of using racist and offensive language.
But isn't trap house a pretty common slang term?
It is, and as Shapiro points out, it doesn't have any inherent racial connotations.
So it seems like intent didn't really matter in this case. It was all about the perceived impact of the words.
Exactly. And this ties back to Shapiro's concern about the power of these DEI bureaucracies.
Okay.
He argues that they often operate under this guilt by accusation model where the focus is on punishing perceived offenses rather than understanding context or intent.
It feels like there's a real danger of overreach there. If we create a system where any word or phrase can be deemed offensive, then people are just going to be afraid to say anything at all.
Right. And Shapiro is also critical of Yale Law Dean Heather Gerken for her response to those student protests that shut down a free speech panel.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
It featured speakers from both the left and the right.
Right.
And he sees it as another example of administrators failing to stand up for free speech and intellectual diversity.
It's interesting that he's calling out people on both sides of the political spectrum. It's not like he's just criticizing liberals or progressives. He's also going after conservatives who he thinks are contributing to this illiberal trend.
Exactly. He's not interested in scoring partisan points. He's trying to make a larger point about the dangers of ideological conformity, regardless of which ideology is in power.
So this is a problem that goes beyond our typical left-right divides.
That's what he's arguing. He believes it's a fundamental threat to the principles of free speech, academic freedom, and the rule of law. And he sees it as a symptom of a broader societal shift towards intolerance and a rejection of open debate.
It's a pretty bleak picture. But I'm guessing he doesn't just leave us there. He offers some potential solutions, right?
He does.
Yeah.
And they're pretty bold. One of the most controversial is his call to abolish DEI bureaucracies altogether.
Whoa. He's not just talking about reforming them. He's saying get rid of them entirely.
Yep. He argues that these offices have become too powerful and that they're more focused on enforcing ideological conformity than promoting true diversity.
So he sees them as part of the problem, not the solution.
Exactly. He believes that the focus on group identity and this constant policing of language and behavior is actually creating a more hostile and divisive environment.
It's interesting because you could argue that both sides are trying to achieve the same thing, a more just and equitable society.
Right.
But they have very different ideas about how to get there.
And that clash is playing out in very real ways on college campuses and in the legal profession.
So how do you have a productive conversation when people have such different fundamental assumptions about justice and fairness?
That's the million-dollar question. And I think that's what makes Shapiro's book so important, even if you don't agree with everything he says. He's forcing us to confront these tough questions and grapple with the complexities of this issue.
It's a conversation we need to have.
Definitely.
It's not about choosing sides. It's about figuring out how to balance these competing values in a way that's fair and just for everyone.
You know, it's interesting. As we've been talking about Shapiro's critique of DEI, he connects it to this much broader trend, the whole explosion of bureaucracy in general.
Okay, so he's saying this isn't just a problem in academia, but like a societal thing.
Exactly. He points out how universities have seen this massive increase in administrative staff over the past few decades, like way more than the growth in faculty.
Interesting. And he's arguing that a big chunk of that growth is in these DEI offices.
Right. He cites some pretty startling statistics. Like one study found that the average university had 3.4 DEI staff for every 100 professors.
Wow. So for every 100 professors, there are more than 3 DEI staff.
Yeah, and some schools have even more.
That's a pretty significant ratio. But is it actually like leading to better outcomes for students?
That's what Shapiro asks. He argues that all this bureaucratic bloat isn't necessarily making things better for students or improving academic outcomes.
You'd think it would.
You'd think so. But he says student satisfaction with their college experience hasn't really improved despite all these extra administrators.
So more bureaucracy, but not necessarily better education.
Right. And he sees DEI as part of this larger problem.
Okay, so how so?
Well, he argues that this huge increase in DEI staff is actually distracting from the core mission of universities, which should be teaching and research.
Makes sense.
Instead, he thinks the focus has shifted towards enforcing ideological conformity and creating this really risk-averse environment.
Just like they're trying to create a space where no one ever feels offended or uncomfortable, which is like impossible.
Exactly. And Shapiro says that in the process, they're sacrificing free speech and academic freedom, which are essential for real education.
It's those unintended consequences again.
Yeah.
You set out to do something good, like create a more inclusive environment, but you end up creating a culture of fear and self-censorship.
Right. And Shapiro digs into the historical roots of DEI too, tracing it back to the affirmative action policies of the 60s and
Oh,
70s.
interesting. So he's saying there's a connection between those policies and the DEI movement today.
He argues that while affirmative action had good intentions, it also sort of set the stage for a system where people are judged more and more based on their group identity and less on their individual merits.
So he sees DEI as an extension of that thinking, but taken to like a whole new level.
Exactly. And he's especially critical of this focus on achieving equity, which often means equal outcomes for everyone, regardless of their effort or merit.
So he's saying that's a dangerous approach.
He thinks it's misguided. He sees it as basically undermining the idea of a level playing field where everyone has a fair shot to succeed based on their own abilities.
It sounds like he's saying it's a form of reverse discrimination, where the focus on group identity ends up hurting individual rights.
That's his argument. And he thinks it ultimately leads to more division and resentment.
It's a very thought-provoking argument, and it challenges a lot of the assumptions people have about DEI and social justice.
For sure. And whether you agree with Shapiro or not, I think he makes us think about some really important questions.
Yeah, like what?
Like, how do we create a society that's truly inclusive and equitable without sacrificing individual rights or shutting down free speech? How do we promote social justice while also upholding individual liberty and equality under the law?
Those are tough questions with no easy answers.
Exactly. And I think that's part of what makes Shapiro's book so important. He's not afraid to ask those hard questions and to really push us to think critically about these issues.
Yeah, he's definitely challenging conventional wisdom and pushing back against what he sees as harmful trends.
Right. And he doesn't just criticize the problem, he also offers solutions.
Okay, so what does he suggest we do?
Well, in addition to abolishing DEI bureaucracies, he says we should eliminate diversity statements.
Those are becoming pretty common in hiring, aren't they?
Oh, yeah. It's basically where applicants have to explain how they'll contribute to diversity and inclusion on campus.
Right.
Shapiro sees these statements as like ideological litmus tests that are designed to weed out anyone who doesn't think the right way about race, gender, and identity.
Wow. So instead of being judged on your qualifications, you're judged on your ideology.
That's what he's saying. And he thinks it's really hurting academic freedom and leading to less intellectual diversity among faculty.
And it's not just about diversity statements, right? He also wants to end all identity-based preferences.
Yeah, in admissions, hiring, contracting, everywhere.
So he's talking about affirmative action, too.
Exactly. He believes that any kind of preference based on identity is discriminatory and undermines equal opportunity.
So he's a strong advocate for that colorblind approach.
Yes. He thinks people should be judged on their merits, not on their race, gender, or any other group affiliation.
It's definitely a controversial position, but I can see where he's coming from.
His point is that achieving diversity through preferential treatment isn't the answer.
Because it creates a system where people are rewarded or punished based on their identity rather than their abilities.
Exactly. And ultimately, he thinks it's counterproductive and harmful.
So he's proposing some pretty radical solutions.
Yeah.
But they all come back to this central concern about free speech and intellectual diversity.
Right. He sees these values as essential for a free and open society, and he's worried that we're losing sight of them.
And it's not just about the academic world, right? It's about society as a whole.
Exactly. He thinks what's happening in law schools is a reflection of what's happening in our culture more broadly.
So what happens on campus doesn't stay on campus.
Right. He thinks these ideas and values are shaping the way we think and operate as a society.
Okay, so we've talked about a lot. Shapiro's personal experience, his critique of DEI, his concerns about free speech, and his proposed solutions. As we wrap up this deep dive, what are your final thoughts?
For me, it all comes back to this question of how we balance these competing values in a diverse society. How do we create a society that's both inclusive and tolerant of different viewpoints? How do we promote social justice while also protecting individual rights?
These are the questions we all need to be thinking about.
Definitely. And I think Shapiro's book does a great job of laying out the challenges and pushing us to engage in these difficult conversations.
Whether you agree with him or not, it's a book that makes you think.
For sure. It's thought-provoking, and it raises some really crucial questions about the direction our society is heading.
So that's our deep dive into Lawless, The Miseducation of America's Elites by Ilya Shapiro. I highly recommend checking it out for yourself. It's a challenging read, but definitely worth it.
Let us know what you think. What parts resonated with you? What questions did it raise for you? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below.
And don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into interesting books and ideas.
Thanks for joining us.
And remember, keep those minds open and keep those conversations going.